Wonderful. Welcome back to the second segment of Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. I'm Mary Massey, and I'm here with co-host for the second segment, John Sakowitz, and I think you have a special offer to make, birthday boy.
I do indeed. I'm the birthday boy, and for my birthday, I want people to become members of KMUD, your community radio station, no matter where you live. And on my Facebook page, I also have a fundraiser.
Talk to the mic.
Simply go to my name, John Sakowitz, Sakowicz, and my fundraiser is at the top of my page. Just become a member, and I'll consider matching, depending upon how much we raise.
Well, yeah.
I'll consider matching it.
Be careful what you wish for.
I will seriously consider it. No, I love this radio station. I've had my program on a number of stations. KMUD is true community radio. These are progressive people, and they're loving and kind people. I don't know how else to say it without sounding corny, but they are, which is why our home is here. So please support KMUD. Give me a birthday gift, become a member, or just go to my Facebook page, throw in any amount of money you want into the pot, and I'll think about matching it.
And also you can speak to our next guest, by calling 707-923-3911, and I will introduce him. He is returning to us. Daniel Sjursen is a retired U.S. Army major and an instructor at West Point. He is a contributing editor at antiwar.com and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. And since we're a little short on time, Danny, welcome to the program. We're going to jump right into our topic about foreign policy, sacred cows, and the U.S. military.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great returning, and I'm glad to jump in and talk about all things foreign policy and militarism.
Danny, you're really one of my favorite guests, brother. I listen to your media output. You know, I'm subscribed to a lot of what you produce, and really your insights carry the weight of an expert. You were an instructor at West Point, besides being a decorated vet in Afghanistan. You really carry a lot of credibility. So thank you for being on the show. I'd like to start out with Biden's Pentagon budget, $750 billion. Too much? Excessive? What do you think?
Well, I mean, too much, wildly excessive, ever growing. The Pentagon budget is like the universe. It was explained to me when I was a kid that the universe is always expanding and never stops. And I'm a decently smart guy. I never got my head around that. Like, what's it expanding into? But the Pentagon budget's kind of like that, isn't it? No matter who's in charge, right? Even if they are attacking pretty far left on domestic policy, even if they're supposed to be a transformational candidate because, Trump was so bad, and he was, the Pentagon budget's like the one thing that's bipartisan. It's untouchable. It's the ultimate sacred cow. And I just think we need to have the courage to say so and ask, why is it that someone who's supposed to be more progressive, someone who's supposed to be in the more liberal party, really just uncritically passes off on this and expects their party to do the same thing? And I think it's wildly excessive. Where does that money go? What is it for? Well, I know this. I keep hearing about healthcare. We can't afford it. Childcare. We can't afford it. I know this, though. The DOD, the Department of Defense's slogan, their recruiting slogan, like be all you can be for the Army, like I said, I think last time on the show, should be the Department of Defense. This is why you can't have nice things.
Yes, indeed. Hey, we have a caller right away, Danny. Are you up for that?
Always.
All right, caller, if you're listening, please go ahead.
Hey, so I had a question. I was wondering, on September 10th, 2001, Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld got on TV and said that we're missing like $21 trillion from the Pentagon's budget. And then 9/11 happened the very next day. I was just wondering why nobody ever talks about how much money is missing from the Pentagon's budget, and in general, why you think people just don't really care about the fact that most of our taxes go to war.
That's a really great question. Folks forget that, look, I'm not a Rumsfeld fan, obviously. Donald Rumsfeld, though, he comes into being the Secretary of Defense before 9/11, and he positioned himself as a reformer, very much like McNamara did. There's a strange correlation there. I'm going to come in and provide sort of like a business savvy and a hard-nosed realism. We're going to trim down, not necessarily the budgets, but we're going to trim down the military into something lighter, more effective for the 21st century. And that involved like a pretty large audit that was put in place, right? So Rumsfeld comes in and looks and is like, where's all this money? September 11th happens, and then we uncritically are like, just throw as much stuff, dollars and blood, against the wall and see what sticks. Of course, none of it stuck in terms of having any effect. I think one of the reasons we don't talk about that is 9/11. I mean, there are these black swan events, as they're called, that sort of like shift paradigms, and people forget what happened before, as though history started on, the morning of September 11th. That's a dangerous way to view things. I think one of the reasons that the American people generally don't question the military budget and how much of their money is going there is because it's just money, they think, right? It seems like there's kitchen table issues and then there's foreign policy. That was not the case in Vietnam when there was a draft, but right now it's just dollars, and it's not a higher war tax per se. We just go into debt for our great-grandchildren and even ourselves, but we are not expected, the average American citizen, to go off and serve. So war is an abstraction, and so is the Pentagon budget. And like so many other things, once a number becomes too high, it may as well be $1 bazillion as far as people are concerned in their brains. And it's an interesting aspect of the human condition, but we have to question it because war and foreign policy and spending on the wars is a kitchen table issue because it limits our options, and there are real trade-offs.
Danny, very well put. And I want to thank the caller for the question. It's absolutely central to this discussion. And in fact, so much so that for years, I would play that's the interview, the CBS interview that Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, gave to CBS on September 10th, literally the day before. I have two favorite YouTubes. One is that Donald Rumsfeld interview declaring a war on waste, fraud, and corruption in the Pentagon to the tune of trillions of dollars, to the tune of $1 out of every $3 missing due to waste, fraud, and corruption. And my other favorite video is President John F. Kennedy, months before his death, speaking to the American Society of Newspaper Publishers at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, literally warning of a shadow government connected to the military-industrial complex, and exhorting the newspaper publishers to conduct their own investigation of a shadow government that President Kennedy himself was not in charge of. These are two. This is the forgotten history of the United States. When Oliver Stone did that remarkable series, A Forgotten History of the United States for Showtime, this is what he was talking about. Danny, you're so much more knowledgeable than I am. Just talk about some of these forgotten lessons of American history that our audience should know about.
At the risk of name dropping, I was in LA, I guess it was 2 months ago, and I'm having dinner with Oliver Stone. We've got a bit of a relationship, and we were talking about this very thing, right? He was talking about his series with Peter Kuznick and talking about Kennedy. Obviously that's his kind of baby that he's really focused on. But one of the things that struck me, and in our conversation went in this direction, isn't it interesting that both Eisenhower and Kennedy, the one thing that they really took from their time in office once they'd been there a while was don't trust the generals, don't trust the intelligence. They were scared of and battled with their own sort of what I guess now they would call deep state, but really just the establishment, professional sort of foreign policy and intelligence people. So Eisenhower is a five-star general who, wins World War II in Europe, or at least leads that campaign, went to West Point from Kansas, not a hippie, right? But he knows the military. And throughout his tenure, his biggest issue isn't with Congress. It's not with the media that's making fun of him for golfing too much. It's with the Pentagon service chiefs. It's battling with them over budgets, to some extent over nuclear policy, but mainly over budgets. And he saw how they were trying to push him. And I think Eisenhower was a great guy to fight back against it because he knew the limits of the military life. He knew the dangers of it. And then, of course, he starts to see something different from the army he came into in 1915, which is that there was this immense power of the industrial side of military-industrial complex. And, of course, he wanted to include Congress in that originally. It's called the military-industrial congressional complex. But Kennedy then comes in running on this idea that there's a missile gap, that, oh, the Soviets are ahead of us and blah, blah, blah. Of course, he kind of knew there wasn't. Ike definitely knew there wasn't, but Ike didn't really want to publicize that for a number of reasons, partly because, he didn't really want to demonstrate our abilities. But once Kennedy gets in, he realizes for sure, he may have already known to some extent, that there's definitely no missile gap. We're way ahead of them. And then the generals kind of and the CIA convince him to continue with the Bay of Pigs, which he does. Big mistake in Cuba and invading with a proxy force. But then they also want him to go to nuclear war over Cuba. And they're also trying to convince him that maybe we should nuke China before they get nuclear weapons. Kill a few million of their children before they become a nuclear power. Maybe we'll even work with the Soviets to do that. But after the Bay of Pigs and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he said, it's documented, he said, the first thing I'm going to tell my successor is don't trust the generals. That they're not to be trusted. And then the other thing that he said during the Cuban Missile Crisis to his brother, I believe, Bobby, is, after every one of the generals said, let's go to war with Cuba, let's invade, every one of them to a man said either nuke or invade Cuba, something crazy like that. He leaves the room, he goes for a walk with Bobby. There's a famous picture, and supposedly he said, these brass hats, right, with all their stuff on their uniform, they've got one thing over us when it comes to these arguments. None of us will be left alive to tell them they're wrong if we follow their advice. And I think that's instructive.
We have another caller, Danny, for you. Caller, if you're listening, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, I'm wondering if you have read Smedley Butler's War as a Racket or are familiar with that. And I want to mention also, in bringing up the Kennedys, June 6th is the unfortunate anniversary of Robert Francis Kennedy being murdered in Los Angeles, and I was a kid when that happened, about 11 years old. Broke my heart. One more thing. This just in on CNN, they're announcing, I swear to God, John and Mary, that DeJoy, Postmaster DeJoy, is under investigation by the Department of Justice. It's good to know that Washington is listening to K-Mud. Thank you.
Yay! Terrific. Go ahead, Danny, with your response.
Smedley Butler, he's like my favorite forgotten figure in American history.
2 medals of honor, Danny. Not one, but 2 Congressional Medals of Honor.
Yeah, he would have won a third for his most heroic thing, but back in the beginning of his career, officers in the Marine Corps couldn't win the Medal of Honor. This is a wild guy, 31 years in service, fights in at least 10 campaigns during that time, including World War I, the Boxer Rebellion. He did all the things, right? Wounded very badly. And then he spends the remainder of his life, 9 years basically, on the road, speaking about war being a racket, that slim volume that every American should be assigned in school, like it's The Outsiders or Sun Also Rises. That's how soon it should be getting to them, but no one has ever heard of it. At the time, he was really popular on the speaking circuit, and this was a time people cared about oratory, but he works himself to death. He was always a very slim guy, like 140 pounds soaking wet, 5'7", right? A lot of heroic soldiers aren't big dudes or women. It's just the way it is. It's about a different kind of courage. He works himself to death, and he literally dies at a fairly young age. One of the questions I ask, and if you Google my name and Smedley Butler, you'll see that I gave a speech at his graveside on the anniversary of the Afghanistan war this October. And then also I've written articles. One of them I wrote was called Where Have You Gone, Smedley Butler? And the idea that I'm raising is, why is there no Smedley Butler today? Why is there no senior general who's helping to lead the anti-war movement? Not because generals should be in the lead of everything, not because the military should be in the lead of everything, but in a society that so adulates its military, the credibility that would come with that and the platform, I think it's sort of a duty to do that. Well, why don't we? Because unlike in Smedley's time, when he was already a rarity, he was already a unique thing, these guys leave their 4-star general positions and they go straight through the revolving door a few times to strategic consultancies, the board of Raytheon, you name it. The last chairmen of the Joint Chief of Staff and leaders of the Afghan War and Central Command have almost to a man worked for Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. General Joe Dunford, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump, Lockheed Martin's board. Our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, Raytheon. So I think that really limits the ability of generals to speak out, because if you speak out, those jobs will not be available for you. Thank you so much for the question.
Smedley, we have another caller for you, Danny. Caller, if you're listening, please go ahead with your question.
Oh, thank you very much. Danny, this is a wonderful and important show. I wanted to come back to your comment about the Black Swan event and the relationship of Kennedy and that speech, and McNamara and Rumsfeld. What is the Black Swan event that could change American public opinion on and bring them up to date on the egregious nature of the budget, the expanding universe budget of the Defense Department, and the failures of our Defense Department as well, since there are clearly wars happening all over the world, and we are not in a position to do anything about any of them. How could you rouse the public to be more aware and to take action and to work against this budget?
You know, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, because it seems that most of the Black Swan events end up making things worse. But what you're describing is like what sort of thing would have to happen in order to get people mobilized. Well, you know, if there were, and this isn't going to happen, but if there were some sort of conscription or draft, I think people will start paying attention pretty quick. And I have mixed feelings about the draft. Andrew Basovich and I have called it the nuclear option for anti-war, you know, and we're not positive that's the way to go or something. But the idea that if people were mobilized, if mothers and fathers had to wake up in the morning when their, you know, son is, and their daughter now is 17, getting ready to graduate from high school, look at the paper and say, man, I actually better start paying attention to this thing going on in Syria, because, you know, my kid might end up over there. I'll tell you this, with China and Russia, a lot of this like playing around that we're doing in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, or even in the Persian Gulf with Iran, with all these missiles that these folks have, I'll tell you what has not happened in the post 9/11 era. And that is that an American ship has not been sunk by a surface to surface or surface to sea missile. But if 400, 600 American sailors went to the deep like they used to in World War II, I do think that would have some galvanizing effect. I, of course, don't want to see that. I want us to pull back and not be sort of, you know, trying to have hegemony everywhere. But an economic collapse of some sort, I think, would also probably have some sort of effect. I mean, if we look at some of the activism around Occupy, similar to what we've seen after some of the more obscene events with racial justice and George Floyd, it does seem that something off.
We're good. All right, we're on. So continue your thought. We have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, so I think just basically it's very important that we reframe the debate in Israel-Palestine around equal rights. We get tied up in the old language of two-state solutions. And yes, I think that Palestinians deserve a state, but now we're operating in the world as it is, which is that with American backing, and only possible with American backing, Israel has put in place policies that have really precluded a true two-state solution. So now we have to start talking about equal rights. And they don't want to give that up either. And I'm not talking about Israelis. I'm talking about the Israeli government, which has moved increasingly to the right and in an ethnocratic rather than a democratic direction. Jewish only Jews have the right to sovereignty, you know, between basically the river and the sea. I mean, that is the basic law. Which is their equivalent of a constitutional amendment, essentially. And I think that America has an enormous amount of complicity in this. We would, if there was actual trials in public opinion, international opinion, if there was real international law, we would have been convicted and thrown in prison, the key thrown away for criminal aiding and abetting.
1 minute.
Danny, we're going to have you on for the full hour next, because what you have to say is just too important. I'll get in the final question here. Our mutual friend Matt Ho was recently talking about is there a network of donors neutralizing peace activism? Do you care to just summarize his argument a bit?
Well, I think that I often joke about there's no money in peace. You know, I'll joke about that when someone asks me, hey, are you getting paid for this trip that you're going on, you know, to speak? And I'll be like, no, I'm doing this one pro bono too. I mean, the reality is there are some donors out there who are supportive of our causes, but there are way more powerful billionaires versus millionaires, right, in many cases, who are opposed to these very things. And so when you take into account the individual donors, but also this is something else that the peace sort of activist funders can't go up against, they just can't match, is the government funds a lot of these entities, and the military industrial complex does through their lobbying, through their political campaigns.
Danny, we need to say goodbye, and we will have you back for the full hour because there's just so much, as John said, to take in. Thank you so much for returning and being our guest today. We really, really appreciate it. If you could just mention briefly how folks can look at your work.
Great. Just skepticalvet.com is my personal website. All my writing is there, and on Twitter @skepticalvet. Everything I do comes through, and my fellows.
That's our show today. Join us again next time.
And again, for my birthday gift, please become a member of KMUD Radio, or just go to my Facebook page and make a donation, however small, to KMUD. It's the charity I'm supporting this birthday. Danny, my brother, thank you so much.
Thank you.